History 425, Week 10. We're continuing on slide 17. Certainly, three of the most sensitive places on China's periphery, as we've discussed, are Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. We have discussed how strong Chinese governments have kept control over these areas. Weaker Chinese governments have not been so successful. There is no love lost, unfortunately, between the peoples of these various regions and the Han Chinese majority. Most recently, however, as we've discussed, the PRC has pursued a policy of sending as many Han Chinese migrants into these areas as could possibly fit, which has caused increasing unrest between the ethnic groups. Now, the Dalai Lama, he was, as we've discussed, he was mostly ignored until, not really ignored, but he was not nearly as prominent a personality internationally before 1989 as he has been since. You recall that in 1989 he won the Nobel Peace Prize, always a political instrument, which was awarded to him because of the unrest in Tibet at that time, and because of his attempts, as perceived by the Nobel Prize Committee, to bring peaceful resolution. It's an interesting question to consider whether he is following the traditional mode of behavior of Dalai Lamas over the course of history as they have tried to deal with China, or whether he's doing something different. I would argue, and you can certainly get something out of the Shakya book here, I would argue that he has learned a great deal from history. He's especially learned from the way his predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama, left Tibet at key times in order to avoid being captured and turned into a puppet, and he re-entered Tibet at key times. The Dalai Lama has I think, followed some of those lessons, but he has gone beyond that. Before we continue, I just want to note, of course, that Chinese leaders remain extremely sensitive about the Dalai Lama, even though they've tried to write him off, tried to ignore him. There's an interesting thing that you will note if you go to China, or even if you just explore the internet, how the Chinese always call Tibet. They don't just say Tibet anymore, especially in the last 10 years. They say China's Tibet. You can imagine what it would mean if all of a sudden the U.S. government started saying, America's Puerto Rico, America's Hawaii. We don't bother. But the Chinese do. Going on to slide 18. So one of the differences, I would say, that the Dalai Lama has one of his different approaches to the problem of dealing with China has been that he has transferred the priest-patron relationship that previously existed before the communists came to power, before even the Chinese nationalists. The priest-patron relationship you can read about in Goldstein. He has transferred that because the communists are absolutely not interested, of course, in having a priest-patron relationship. He's transferred it overseas to the willing publics in the West who have come to see him as an important teacher. And because there are so many people in the West who see the condition of the Tibetan people to be something that's important, because there are others in the West who have at least casual sympathy with the Tibetans, this has become a political issue in the West, whether or not the host government, whether or not the White House, whether or not the LC Palace, whether or not Buckingham Palace, not so much Buckingham Palace, number 10 Downing Street, whether or not support is being given to the Tibetan people through their widely recognized leader, the Dalai Lama. So national leaders have to make a choice. It's not an easy choice for them to make. If it was somebody like Henry Kissinger, he would just say, ignore the Dalai Lama. But that's an easy thing for him to say because he doesn't have to worry about getting elected. He is focused on geopolitical realities as he perceives them. But I would argue that a geopolitical reality, I'm on slide 19 now, I would argue that a geopolitical reality is that the Dalai Lama has built up a great deal of influence overseas, and he cannot be ignored by these national leaders, and this is a continuing bilateral problem between different countries in the West and the PRC. And you can see evidence of this in the press coverage that the Dalai Lama has given, a sample of which is on slide 19. Going on to slide 20. A continuing problem in China has been the identification of the Panchen Lama. You'll remember that the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama were rivals in the past. They were more cooperative in their in the later years of the Panchen Lama. They were actually communicating with each other, and they were in essence covert allies against the Chinese. As pretty much after the Cultural Revolution, when the Panchen Lama ate a lot of bitterness, you might say. When he died, that is, the Panchen Lama died in 1989. There was an effort to find a successor, and during the time that this was happening, there was covert communication between Dharamsala, the Dalai Lama's people, and the people who were doing the search for his successor, unbeknownst to Beijing. They found a young child, and this child was immediately arrested and taken away by the PRC government. So there you go. They identified their own Panchen Lama, and they have historical justification in their eyes for doing this. And they plan to do the same thing with the Dalai Lama. So when he eventually dies, this is going to turn into an interesting problem to watch. As we go on to slide 21, I can't imagine that when the Dalai Lama dies, that the way both sides, that is Dharamsala and Beijing, will react to this will in any way improve Han, Chinese, and Tibetan relations. I believe that the Chinese side will continue to try to send as many Han Chinese into Tibet as possible, and that there will be continuing tension, and the direction that this will take, it is difficult to say. Chinese like to point to the history of the United States and say that you guys got rid of the Indians, Native Americans. We're getting rid of the Tibetans. This is what they'll say in unguarded moments when there's no possibility of note-taking. Anyway, that's the way people really feel. Many people, anyway. Going on to slide 22. A place that Beijing is trying to be successful in being, in their eyes, Mr. Nice Guy, is Hong Kong. There was an agreement between the British and the Chinese that was signed during the time of Margaret Thatcher 3 decades ago about turning over Hong Kong in 1997, and indeed it happened on time. And there were guarantees made about having one country, that is China, and two systems, the system on the Chinese mainland and the system that had evolved in Hong Kong, which was highly capitalist. And indeed, besides being a window on the West for China for such a long time, as we've previously discussed, Hong Kong is now an experimentation, an experimental ground, a proving ground. That's it. They're a proving ground for certain policies regarding handling the press, handling education, handling social problems, the homeless, and so forth. The Communist Party is actually trying to see what works in Hong Kong, with the idea that the rest of China, especially the cities, should be as rich, as prosperous, as stable as is Hong Kong. However, there is this problem in Hong Kong, and that is that Beijing's program, basically, Beijing can't keep their hands out. They can't keep their hands off of Hong Kong. That's the blunt way of stating it. They have talked about one country, two systems. They have said they will allow this Hong Kong capitalist system with free press and so on to exist for 50 years after 1997. But the fact of the matter is that there's always pressure, just like there was pressure in Tibet. Even though Mao Zedong did not want any sort of quick social change in Tibet, the cadres on the ground became frustrated with this, and they started to make their own changes, thinking that this is what the party really wanted anyway. The same sort of thing really is happening in Hong Kong. There is regular interference in the Chinese language press. One of the newspaper links I'm giving to you in the last slide here is to the South China Morning Post, which is the English language newspaper in Hong Kong, its flagship English language newspaper. There has been some interference, but not too much with the SCMP. However, it's a much different situation than with the Chinese press. The Chinese press is more often messed with by the propaganda department through the use of phone calls. Don't run stories on this, don't do that. They don't get the same level of supervision that newspapers do on the mainland. As well, local elections used to be relatively important in Hong Kong before 1997. They were never strictly democratic. They were the British were certainly not perfect proponents of the democratic method in Hong Kong before 1990. But then in the last years of the administration there, they began to after the agreements were signed with the Thatcher government, they began to try to institute more direct elections in Hong Kong, which made the Chinese absolutely livid, particularly at the last administrator of Hong Kong by the British. And so since 1997, there's been a very significant rollback in who can vote for whom in the country. Not the country, in the former colony, which is now a special administrative region. In particular, it's never been possible to vote for the chief executive of Hong Kong, who is appointed by Beijing. There's a sort of a complicated election system for other people who serve on the legislative council there. But the bottom line is that Beijing has been trying very slowly to increase its control over policy and the press in Hong Kong, and people have become more and more upset about that as time has gone on. Going on to slide 23. Taiwan. No politician in mainland China can survive if he suggests allowing the people on Taiwan to decide their own fate, to be a part of China or to become independent, such as happens with the U.S. and Puerto Rico. President Obama recently made statements about the elections that have been held in Puerto Rico to decide on statehood or independence, and the basic line of the U.S. government has been, if the majority of people want independence, they've got it. If they want statehood, they've got it. If they want to remain a commonwealth of the United States, they've got it. No problem. Whatever the majority of people want, they've got it. And there's been a lot of division in Puerto Rico about this over the years. But in China, there's no way you could ever say that. You would immediately be arrested for subverting the authority of the state. And this is because the recovery of Taiwan, as they like to say, is directly tied in the minds of many with ending the century of humiliation. We've talked about this a great deal, and I don't think it's necessary to belabor it anymore. However, in the early years of U.S. recognition of China, before and after 1979, there were promises made to the Chinese that the U.S. would eventually not only withdraw from Taiwan completely, its military, but also that they would not support Taiwan if there was a conflict and the Chinese wanted to retake it. But since 1989, the Tiananmen massacre, this has been completely impossible. And so we have on both sides, the United States and China, we have these immovable objects in policy. Going on to slide 24. Another problem, another core interest, we're still on core interests here, is these islands, these senkakus as they're called in Japanese, the Diaoyutai Islands in Chinese. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the bottom line is that both sides have historical claims that they consider to be legitimate. The United States has tried to avoid getting involved in this. Although the United States has said it will observe its defense treaty with Japan if it's attacked. When the United States handed these islands back to Japan in 1971, not only the mainland, but also Taiwan was upset about it. Chiang Kai-shek in particular was upset about it. You can read about that in the Taylor book. Why is it such a big deal? Well, there's oil. And whoever might back down, whether they're in Taiwan or they're in China or they're in Japan, any politician who backed down on this issue would suffer at the polls if we're talking about Taiwan or Japan, and they would risk immediate arrest and imprisonment if they were in China. There you go. There's continued risk in this problem. Let's go on to slide 25. I like to call it the cow tongue. The so-called 9-dashed line. There are a lot more dashes on this map, but the original maps that were issued by the Chinese back in the 70s, making this claim, had 9 dashes on them to take in this amount of territory. And the newer claims that have come out have extended the area of the claims even closer to the shores of the countries who are China's neighbors, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. There's oil, again, a big problem. There's drilling going on by companies from all the different countries. There have been forcible seizures of different islands, once controlled by the Vietnamese and the Filipinos by the Chinese, and it's a continuing difficult problem. Going on to slide 26. Burma, or Myanmar, in English you can say Myanmar, in Burmese it's Myanmar. Burma had been a close ally of the Chinese for several decades. However, as the Chinese have moved into Burma in the past 10 years, in with more force, with more people, with more business. There's been difficulty on the Burmese side with perception that the Chinese were becoming a bit too influential in this previously isolated country. And so this is the main reason why the Burmese decided that they needed to invite in the Americans and the West. But the Burmese knew that they needed to reform their political system to a degree in order to do this, because of the embargo that the United States had on Burma for human rights reasons. So without getting too much into Burmese politics, the bottom line here is that the Chinese, who once considered Myanmar, Burma, to be their backyard, their territory almost, are now challenged in this area, and they have been building this pipeline that you see illustrated on this map, which is important to save money on shipping for oil from the Middle East, and it's important to its influence it would have on stabilizing Chinese energy supplies, which otherwise would have to go through the Straits of Johor near Singapore, considered to be a strategic choke point under the control of the U.S. Navy. So again, problems China has with the United States, and the positions of these two countries in the world are apparent in this bilateral relationship, which is very important to China and is not discussed very much in the U.S. press. Going on to slide 27, we can talk a little bit about North Korea. The 1980s and 90s were filled with these reports of North Korean spy boats landing commandos on the Japanese west coast, kidnapping Japanese people, taking them back to North Korea. This is still an issue today, even though some of the kidnapped individuals have returned. They were kidnapped in order to work in North Korean spy schools and teach people, illegal agents, how to be more like Japanese people and blend in so they could go to Japan and points beyond and work for the North Korean secret services. Why am I bringing this up? It's because this is one of the many strange kinds of behaviors on the part of the North Korean government, going on to slide 28, that have made it a pariah internationally, yet it is a very close ally of China. The Chinese used to refer to their relationship with the North Koreans as being as close as lips and teeth, although they don't do that so much anymore. And now there's more and more talk about the Chinese being upset with the North Koreans, particularly because they have exploded what are purported to be nuclear weapons and are developing their rocket capabilities. But it seems unlikely that the Chinese will ever really give up on the North Koreans, because it is just as much a core interest, we're still on core interests, to China to make sure that the Korean Peninsula is not controlled by the Japanese or the Americans, as it is to make sure that Tibet remains under Chinese control. Let's stop this audio here, and we'll go on to slide 29.